I was standing in my mother's living room, still in my work hoodie, when the donation counter on the TV screen hit 50,000 viewers. Preston's charity livestream had been running for 2 hours. People in the comments were calling him a hero, a saint, a blessing to the world. I had called him those things too more than once. I walked in holding my phone, ready to show my mother the new donation I had just made, when I heard his voice come through the speakers differently. He had stepped away from the microphone but hadn't turned it off. He was laughing, not the grateful, emotional laugh he used for donors. This was different. Careless. Cold. People will always pay when you show them crying kids, he said. My mother was in the background, clapping her hands like it was a football game. My stomach dropped so fast I grabbed the door frame. The charity logo on screen, the one I had worn on a t-shirt and shared on every platform I owned, stared back at me like a stranger's face. My name is Zoe. I was 26 years old, living in the same house I grew up in, working freelance cybersecurity contracts while saving enough to finally move out. I was the quiet one, the younger sister who nobody in the family thought about twice. Preston was the golden child. Charming, loud, always at the center of every room. I waited until the live stream ended before I said anything. Then I went straight to Preston and told him what I had heard. He didn't flinch. He didn't look sorry. He just leaned back in his chair and said, "You're being dramatic, Zoe." My mother walked in from the kitchen and told me to stop causing problems. "You've always been too emotional," she said, wiping her hands on a dish towel. I stood there with my mouth open. I had donated hundreds of dollars to that charity over 3 years. I had skipped dinners out, canceled small trips, and pushed everyone I knew to donate too. I had even organized a fundraiser after losing my best friend, using her memory to raise money for what I believed was a real cause. The pride I had felt, the warmth of believing my family was doing good in the world, turned to ash in my chest. I had not supported a charity. I had funded a lie. And the 2 people who should have protected me had been laughing about it the whole time. That night we all sat around the dinner table like nothing had happened. Preston talked about his plans to buy a new car. Something sleek and expensive. "It's for charity outreach," he said, cutting into his steak. "Image matters when you're doing this kind of work." My mother nodded and said it was a smart investment. I sat quietly, pushing food around my plate, watching them both. Something had shifted in the way I saw them. Every word felt like a code I was only now beginning to understand. I thought back over 3 years of stories Preston had told. Sick children, desperate parents, hospital rooms. None of it had ever felt wrong before. But now, with his real voice still fresh in my memory, nothing felt right. I started noticing small things. The stories he told about certain donors changed depending on who was in the room. Numbers he mentioned at dinner didn't match what I had seen on the website. I didn't point any of it out. I just listened carefully and started committing everything to memory. 2 days later, I went to the charity website for the first time in months, not to donate but to look. Really look. I scrolled through the Our Team page and stopped cold. My photo was there. Underneath it, the words, "Founding supporter Zoe." I had never agreed to that. I had never been asked. I kept scrolling and found something worse. My old university email address was listed as the contact for 3 separate donor accounts. Accounts I had never created. My name, my face, my email, all of it used without my permission. I felt sick in a way that was different from sadness. It wasn't just betrayal. It was violation. They had taken pieces of my identity and built their lie around them, using me as proof that the charity was real. A real person to make a fake cause look trustworthy. I closed my laptop, sat in the dark for a long time and breathed slowly. I wasn't going to cry. I wasn't going to confront anyone. Not yet. First, I needed to understand exactly how far this went. I was a cybersecurity graduate. I had spent 4 years learning how to find things that people tried to hide online. That night I pulled up archived versions of the charity's website going back 3 years and started cross-referencing everything. What I found made my hands go still on the keyboard. Donor lists had been duplicated, the same names appearing in different campaigns as if they were different people. Medical reports attached to fundraising posts were recycled. The same story about a sick child had been reposted 4 separate times with 4 different names and 4 different photos. Every piece of emotional content that had made thousands of people reach for their wallets, the desperate families, the hospital rooms, the children with tired eyes, had been manufactured. Carefully and deliberately. I had spent 3 years believing those stories because I wanted to believe people could be that good. Instead, every single post had been engineered to produce donations. I was not an innocent bystander who happened to support a bad cause. I had been a chosen part of the design. I kept digging. I traced one specific donation route, a large transfer from a campaign Preston had run 6 months earlier. I followed the money through payment processor records that were partially visible in cached web pages. The trail led to a shell account registered under a name I didn't recognize at first. But when I ran it through a public business registration database, it connected directly to an alias Preston had used for a small company he had registered 2 years ago. I remembered him mentioning that company once briefly and then never again. My hands were shaking so badly I had to press them flat on the desk before I could keep typing. This wasn't my brother skimming a little money off the top. The route was designed, layered, built by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The money moved in careful stages, disappearing a little further with each step, making it nearly impossible to follow the full path. Nearly. I had followed it. And now I knew exactly where one of the threads began, and I was not going to let it go. The next evening I was in the kitchen making coffee when Preston walked in. He grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge and stood beside me without speaking for a moment. Then he said, "You know what ruins people in this industry? Curiosity. People start asking questions they don't need to ask, and suddenly their careers fall apart." He smiled when he said it, not warmly. Flat. Careful. He walked out without waiting for my response. An hour later, my mother sat beside me on the couch and patted my hand. "You should be grateful," she said quietly. "A lot of people would love to be where you are. Part of something successful. Part of this family." She said it like she was giving me a gift. But by then I knew the difference between an offer and a warning. I nodded, smiled softly, and said nothing. Inside I was completely still. They were watching me more closely than I had realized. That was fine. Watching me wouldn't help them. I had already found more than they knew. I spent the following weekend going through every image on the charity website. I had learned in school how to run a reverse image search, how to trace a photo back to where it originally came from. I ran every single child's picture through the search tool one by one. The results came back fast and terrible. Most of the photos were stock images, generic pictures sold on photography websites that anyone could buy and use. Some had been lightly edited, brightness adjusted or backgrounds cropped, to make them look personal and real. A few images didn't appear anywhere online at all, which suggested they had been taken from private social media accounts without permission. None of these children had ever been connected to the charity. Not a single one had ever received $1. I had cried looking at some of those photos. I had donated in their names. I had told my friends their stories with genuine heartbreak in my voice. The anger that moved through me then was not loud or sharp. It was deep and still. And it did not leave. I almost missed the second server entirely. It was buried. Not on the charity's main domain, but on a subdomain registered under a slightly different name. A small variation, nearly invisible unless you were reading raw DNS records carefully. I got in through a security gap in their backend that had never been patched, the kind of vulnerability that only someone with my specific training would know to look for. What I found inside made everything I had already uncovered look small. Encrypted transaction logs. Hundreds of them. Transfers moving through multiple accounts across different countries before landing in overseas holdings tied to shell companies I had never heard of. I ran the numbers slowly, checking each total twice. When I finally added everything up, my chest tightened. This was not a few $1,000s. It was not even hundreds of thousands. The money funneled through this system over 3 years ran into the millions. My family had not simply scammed kind-hearted people. They had built an entire empire on stolen grief, and hidden it carefully enough that no one had caught them yet. I had been telling myself that maybe my mother didn't fully understand what Preston was doing, that she was just being loyal without knowing the whole truth. I needed to believe that because the alternative felt too painful to hold. Then I found her name. It wasn't hidden the way Preston's aliases were. It appeared clearly in the operational records I pulled from the subdomain, direct and undeniable. Helen managed what the internal files called donor relations. She wrote the emotional follow-up emails. She handled the thank you messages that made donors feel personally connected to the cause. She maintained the lists and tracked which donors were most likely to give again, based on how they had responded to previous campaigns. She was not an uninformed mother standing on the sidelines. She was a central part of the operation. She had looked me in the eyes at dinner. She had patted my hand on the couch. She had called me too emotional for tech work. All while running the system that stole from millions of people, including her own daughter. I sat with that truth for a long time before I moved again. That was the night I stopped crying. I remember it clearly. I was at my desk at 2 in the morning, surrounded by open documents and transaction logs and screenshots, and I felt tears building the way they had every night for the past 2 weeks. But something shifted before they fell. I looked at the screen. I looked at everything I had collected, and I realized that what I was sitting in front of was not a disaster. It was a map. Every transfer, every alias, every fake account, it was a trail. And trails could be followed. They could be documented. They could be used. I closed my eyes, breathed in slowly, and made a decision. I was not going to storm into the living room and confront anyone. I was not going to call the police that night and hope they believed me without enough evidence. I was going to be patient. I was going to be thorough. I was going to think like a system, precise, methodical, and impossible to argue with. When I was finished, there would be no loopholes. No missing pieces. Only the truth laid out so clearly that no one could look away from it. Over the next 2 weeks, I worked in silence. Every night after my family went to sleep, I built what I privately called my counter system. I created mirror copies of every transaction I had found, all stored on an encrypted drive that only I could access. I tagged each transfer with its source, destination, and date. I built a full timeline showing 3 years of the operation in clear, organized detail. But I didn't stop there. Alongside the documentation, I began constructing a financial routing network, a quiet framework that sat invisibly beside their system without touching it. Not yet. It was designed to do one specific thing when the right moment came. Take every dollar sitting in their hidden accounts and move it somewhere real. Somewhere it could actually help people. I was not planning to steal. Stealing would make me no different from them. I was planning to correct what had been done. There is a meaningful difference between those two things. I held on to that difference very carefully during those long silent nights, because it was the line I refused to cross no matter what. 3 weeks into my investigation, a message arrived from someone I hadn't expected to hear from. It came from Jordan, a former colleague I had worked alongside briefly during an internship 2 years earlier. Jordan was methodical, careful, and one of the sharpest researchers I had ever met. The message was short. I need to talk to you. Not online. In person. We met at a coffee shop 2 days later. Jordan slid a folder across the table without much introduction. Someone else was looking into your brother's charity about 6 months ago, Jordan said. A journalist. She had pulled financial records and was getting close to something real. I asked where she was now. Jordan looked at the table for a moment before answering. She deleted every social media account in a single night. Her editor says she withdrew the story without giving a reason, and hasn't been publicly reachable since. A cold feeling settled at the base of my neck. This was no longer just a family problem. Someone had gotten close to the truth and then disappeared completely from public view. Whatever Preston was protecting, he had been willing to go further than I had imagined to protect it. After meeting Jordan, I moved faster. I had been careful before. Now I had to be completely invisible. I wrote a trace script, small, clean, designed to leave no footprint inside their system, and found a way to inject it through a vulnerability in the charity's third-party payment plugin. It took 4 nights to get the connection working correctly. When it finally held, I sat back and watched my screen quietly. Live transactions began appearing in real time. Real donations from real people, flowing in every hour of the day and night. I watched each dollar move from the donation page through 2 intermediate accounts before disappearing into the shell network I had already mapped. Seeing it happen live was completely different from reading old records. This was happening right now, today, while people went about their ordinary lives believing they were helping sick children. With my trace script running, I had direct eyes inside the operation for the first time. I recorded every transaction number. I noted every timestamp. I didn't miss a single movement. The picture I was building was becoming airtight. About a week after I planted the trace script, Preston's behavior started to change. He was quieter at breakfast. He spent long periods staring at his laptop with a tight, concentrated expression. One evening I heard him through his bedroom door, his voice low and careful. "There are gaps in the weekly reports," he said to someone on the phone. "Small ones. Check the intern accounts first." He came out afterward and told my mother that the charity's tracking software had been glitching unexpectedly. He said he was going to bring someone in to examine the back end. I kept my face completely neutral. I nodded at the appropriate moments. I offered no opinions. But inside, something settled quietly in my chest. A small, steady confidence that had not been there before. He was scared. He didn't know where the problem was originating. He was looking at his interns, his staff, everyone around him. It had not occurred to him once to look at me. The invisibility that my family had made me feel my entire life had just quietly become the most powerful tool I had. The donor database I accessed through the trace script was much larger than I had prepared myself for. It was not just ordinary people who had been scammed. Scrolling through the full records, I found names I recognized: local politicians who had donated publicly to improve their own image, social media influencers who had promoted the charity to millions of followers, and at least 3 mid-sized corporations that had made large official donations as part of formal community outreach programs. These were not small private contributions. They were public endorsements. Their names, logos, and written statements had been used to make the charity appear legitimate and trustworthy to everyone who saw them. If the truth came out, the damage would reach far beyond my family. It would touch careers, companies, and public figures who had no idea they had been made part of a fraud. The full weight of what I was sitting on settled over me slowly. I was not holding evidence of a simple family crime. I was holding something that could send shockwaves across an entire network of people. Everything I did next had to be precisely right. One Sunday morning, my mother sat down beside me at the kitchen table while I was eating breakfast. She poured herself coffee and was quiet for a while. Then she asked very casually, "Do you still trust the system, Zoe? The way things work in this family?" I kept my eyes on my plate. "Of course," I said. "Why would anything be different?" She studied the side of my face without responding right away. "Preston works very hard," she said finally. "We all do. It would be a real shame if something disrupted that." She said it the way you might comment on the weather outside, lightly without emphasis. But I had spent enough time listening carefully to know how much weight her light words carried. She was testing me, checking whether I had gotten too close to something she needed me to stay away from. I looked up and gave her a small, easy smile. "I know how hard he works," I said. She relaxed visibly and moved on to other conversation. I said nothing more. But I noted that they were growing nervous, and nervous people make mistakes that patient people are positioned to catch. The final piece came from a folder I nearly deleted by mistake. It was buried deep in the second server, filed under a name that looked like a meaningless string of numbers. Inside were audio files from what sounded like internal planning meetings recorded over the past 3 years. Preston's voice was clear. So was my mother's. I sat with headphones in and listened to every recording across 2 long nights. What I heard removed every remaining doubt I had been unconsciously holding on to. They had planned the entire operation from the very beginning. They had decided which real charities to imitate closely enough to seem credible. They had calculated which illnesses would generate the highest emotional response and the most repeat donations. And then, in a recording dated almost exactly 3 years ago, I heard my name. "Zoe is the perfect anchor," Preston said. "She's in cybersecurity. She has a clean reputation, and people trust her judgment. If she's publicly attached to this, it gives everything legitimacy." My mother agreed without hesitation. I had not been included by chance. I had been selected deliberately as a tool to make their lie feel real enough to believe. I activated the counter system on a Tuesday night 6 weeks after I had first started building it. The routing network I had constructed sat silently alongside their financial infrastructure, connected to every account I had traced. When I switched it on, nothing visible changed. No alerts. No alarms. No money moved yet. But from that moment, every transaction flowing through their system passed through a mirror that I controlled completely. I had configured it to hold, to keep every incoming dollar in a temporary digital pause just long enough for me to redirect it at the precise right moment. I had also spent the previous week verifying a careful list of real, legitimate organizations, charities and hospitals with published financial records, verified tax status, and documented histories of actual work. These were where the money would go when the time came. I had already contacted their administrative offices to let them know an anonymous routed donation might be arriving. Beyond that, I had compiled every piece of evidence I had gathered and sent sealed copies to 2 independent fraud investigators and a federal financial crimes unit. I was fully ready. All I needed now was the right moment. The charity gala was held on a Friday evening at a rented event space downtown. Preston had been planning it for 2 months. It was the biggest fundraising event the charity had ever hosted. Professional lighting, catering staff, cameras positioned throughout the room, and a guest list that included some of the most prominent donors in the city. I arrived in a plain black dress and took a seat near the back. Nobody paid much attention to me. I was just Preston's quiet younger sister, the one the family never thought about twice. That suited me perfectly. I had my bag on the seat beside me and my phone in my hand. My trace script was running. My routing system was armed and waiting. Every financial feed connected to the charity was flowing through my mirror in real time. I watched Preston across the room, moving between guests with easy confidence, shaking hands and smiling at cameras. He looked completely comfortable, completely certain that tonight was going to go exactly the way he planned. I took a slow, quiet sip of water and watched him walk toward the stage. Preston stepped onto the stage just after 8 o'clock to a full round of applause. He looked the way he always looked in public, warm, certain, and full of quiet purpose. He thanked the donors individually. He told a story about a child who had supposedly received emergency treatment, thanks to the charity's most recent campaign. People in the audience wiped their eyes. He built the moment the way he always did, slow, careful, letting the emotion gather naturally. Then he announced with a wide smile that tonight's live donations had already broken every record the charity had ever set. The crowd responded with more applause. I watched the donation counter on the large event screen climbing steadily. I opened the interface on my laptop and checked the counter on my end, the one showing how much of that money was currently flowing through my mirror. I let the applause grow louder. I let the number climb higher. I waited until Preston spread his arms wide, looked up toward the ceiling, and let out a slow breath of what appeared to be genuine gratitude. Then I pressed the single button I had spent 6 weeks building toward. The screens changed first. The donation counter slowed. Then it stopped. Then it began moving in the wrong direction. Confusion spread across the room in a quiet rolling wave. People turned to each other with uncertain expressions. Preston lowered his arms and looked at the display. His face changed in under 2 seconds, from celebration to something I had never seen on him before. Real unguarded panic. Staff members rushed to the AV desk. Someone grabbed a phone. My mother appeared from near the side entrance, scanning the room with sharp, searching eyes. The counter reached 0. The event's financial display went dark. Preston's microphone picked up his voice asking what was happening, and the question echoed through the entire space in a way he had clearly not intended. I sat near the back with my laptop closed and my hands folded calmly in my lap. I was not looking panicked. I was not looking confused. I watched my brother standing on that stage with no donations, no answers, and no control over a situation he had spent years building. And I felt nothing but a deep, complete stillness. While Preston's team moved frantically around the event space, my routing system was finishing its work. Every dollar that had been sitting in the hidden accounts, the layered, carefully concealed millions I had spent weeks tracing through shell companies and offshore holdings, was moving. Not into my account. Not into anything connected to me in any form. It was transferring into the list of verified organizations I had spent a week confirming as legitimate. A children's hospital in Ohio. A food aid organization operating across 3 states. A verified medical assistance fund for low-income families. A real education nonprofit with 15 years of documented, published work. I watched the transfer confirmations appear on a secondary screen, one after another. Each one felt like a small, deliberate correction, like setting something back into its proper position after watching it sit wrong for too long. I had not stolen anything. I had moved stolen money to the places it had always been publicly promised to go. The charity's accounts didn't empty because of me. They emptied because the money finally, for the first time, went exactly where it was supposed to. The authorities arrived at the event space 40 minutes after the screens went dark. I had sent my complete compiled evidence, every transaction log, every voice recording, every shell account connection, every duplicate donor file and fake medical record, to 2 independent fraud investigators and a federal financial crimes unit 10 days before the gala. They had spent those 10 days building their own parallel case around my documentation. When they walked through the entrance that night, they already knew exactly who they were looking for and exactly what they had done. Preston saw them coming before they reached him. I watched his face move through several expressions in fast succession: disbelief, calculation, and then something I had genuinely never seen on him: fear. Not performed fear. The kind that sets in when every exit is already closed before you realize you needed one. My mother was escorted quietly through a side door. Preston was met at the edge of the stage. Every account was frozen before the night ended. Every alias, every shell company, every layer of the network I had mapped for 6 weeks, all of it documented, time-stamped, and already in official hands. There was nowhere left to go. 3 months later, I walked into a real nonprofit office for the first time. It was a modest building, nothing impressive from the outside. Painted walls, folding tables, volunteers working in mismatched chairs pulled from different rooms. They helped children in low-income communities access after-school programs and basic medical care. Some of the redirected funds had reached them within a week of the gala night. The director shook my hand and told me they had been able to help 63 more families than expected that quarter. She didn't know my full story. I didn't tell it. I just nodded, looked around the room, and let it feel real. Preston and Helen were facing federal fraud charges. The trial was set for the following spring. Jordan had connected me with a legal team also pursuing civil cases on behalf of the thousands of donors who had been deceived over 3 years. My name had been removed from every fake page. My identity was fully my own again. I didn't celebrate any of it. I stood in that small, honest office, breathed in the quiet, and let myself feel something I hadn't felt in a very long time, completely clean.